Hello and welcome to EE333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take the example that we started last time, and we're going to continue it by enhancing our constructors and refining some of the logic inside of them. You'll also notice that in this video, I have changed my second constructor to take the same flag approach that we did last time. So I'm going to clean this one up. Notice what I'm doing now is inside of the second constructor, I am going to go ahead and set the status simply equal to EE333 dot status dot incomplete or unknown at the beginning, and then set it to incomplete as we identify that one of our parameters is missing, which brings us then to what we do in both of our constructors when we feel that we have all of the arguments that we expected to have. So at the end of this, then what we want to do is we simply want to change then the status. For instance, for our system, it might make sense to set it to active. In other words, once a user has been successfully completed. Now, this is not going to be universal. As a matter of fact, we're going to see an example in just a few minutes where you might want to do this a little bit differently. But what we want to do now is we want to go up here to our first constructor, and then after we generate the ID, we also want to make sure then to essentially activate our users. So EE333 status and then active, which brings us back to how are we going to generate the ID? Well, we're going to use a very simple approach here. So use a simple combination of characters. And what I mean by that is we're just simply going to say this dot ID is going to be equal to first name, and then we're going to use one of the string methods, the character at method, that allows for us to specify the first letter of the first name, and we are going to concatenate it then with the last name that was provided. Now, note this allows for no globalization. In other words, every ID, there is a potential of an ID conflict because we're not checking to make sure that every ID is unique. Okay, so no checking for unique IDs. We're going to come back to this. In preparation for that, I want to do one other thing. I want to create a temporary string up here. I'm going to call it ID. And what I'm going to do is before we set this .id equal to that, I'm going to use a temporary variable here. I'm just going to say ID is equal to first name dot character at plus last name. And for right now, I'm just going to simply put this as a placeholder because we will use this later. Which then brings us to our third constructor. And the idea is that, as I mentioned in the first video, we want to be able to essentially get the contents of a file and turn it into an object. Okay. There are other ways of going about doing this, but to start simple here, what I want to do is I want to add one more constructor here. I'm going to call this one public user string, and I'm going to call this one then a custom string. And this constructor will read the properties from a string or text. So this constructor would then allow for us to take a string from a file and create an object of class user from it. Now, we are not going to take this approach, and here's the reason why. Let's say, for instance, that our file format changes. And then what we would have to do then is inside of this constructor, be able to somehow figure out what the custom string is supposed to be, and it wouldn't support, it would be difficult to support in multiple different types. Let's say our colon notation, CSV, XML, or JSON. And then the next possibility would be then we come along and we create another constructor called public user string, and then let's call this one XML string. The problem here then is that we would have two constructors with the same signature. So your third thought should be, well, what if we create a constructor with a second parameter, maybe another enumerator that specifies all of the different custom strings or formats that we expect to handle. Then the downside, of course, with that is that inside of our user constructor, we will need to know about all of the different possible formats. Once again, a little bit unwieldy, not impossible, but a little bit unwieldy. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to now use this as an example of why we would use then a static method. So rather than have these constructors that are going to be responsible for parsing a string and turning it into an object, rather what we want to do now is we want to create a factory method or a static method. We're going to also make this one public. And this particular method is going to return back a user, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to call this one import custom. We can improve on the naming later on, but import custom is going to accept a string of a custom string. And temporarily what we're going to do, just to get the errors to go away, we're going to have it return null. Now we need to fix this, obviously. And then this will allow for us to do something like public static user, then import XML. I don't know how you want to write it. And then string, we'll just have an XML string here now. All right, gets around a couple of problems that we were having. The other thing we want to do is we also want to ultimately keep track of the user IDs that we are importing and exporting. And so a good way to do that would be also to use a static array list or a static collection of some sort that will allow for us then to, at the very least, store the IDs, if not all of the objects that we create. In addition to the static import methods, we also want to create instance level export methods. In other words, we assume that we have successfully completed an object and then want to be able to turn around and export it. These are essentially fancy toStrings. So we're going to go ahead and set these up down here. We'll come back to these in just a little bit, but we're going to have a public string, and we'll call this one export custom. And for right now, just to keep our code able to compile, we're going to simply return empty quotes, and then as a placeholder, we're also going to have public string export XML. And once again, we're going to return empty quotes. Once again, we need to fix this. All right, so I'm going to put this comment here in several places. Essentially, it's going to mark to-dos that we need to do. And then up here, we also, I believe we had one in our import. There we go. Okay. Now, the last step that we want to do in this setup is, remember we mentioned in an earlier video that we'll need to check to see whether a unique ID exists. There's a couple of different ways to go about doing this. But one thing that we can do is we can simply create a global array list that will keep track of all of our instances of our user. And so to do that, we simply come up here and we create a private static, because we want it to be shared among all of the instances of the user. In other words, we want this to be a class level variable. So we have a private static, and it's going to reside, the object that we want to use is going to reside in java.util.ArrayList, and we want it to be of type user. And we're simply going to call this one users. Okay. Now, just like in any other method, in any other field, we can go ahead and create the getters and setters. So we want to be able to get the users. We don't necessarily want to be able to set them. Okay, so that way outside of our class, we can return all of the users. So if you scroll down here, I like to put these up top. But you can see here, this is going to return all of our users. So I'm going to push this one up top because I like to have it as one of my first methods here. Okay. Now, what does that get us? Well, basically, every time we create a new user using our constructor, and once we have validated all of the information, okay, we want to add it to our collection. Now, here's where this gets interesting, because now we have to decide, do we want to add a user to our collection if they are in fact not active? Okay, so a little bit of a decision to make here. This is where the flags come into play. You could probably argue both ways. For this example, what we're going to do is we're only going to add fully constructed users to our collection. So only add fully constructed users to our collection. So in this case, what we will do is we'll say EE333.user.users.add, and what I want to do is I want to add this to it. If we do it in the constructor that accepts 2 parameters or input arguments, we also want to turn around and add it to the second constructor and subsequently to any other constructor. Now, the other thing that we want to do is we said that we wanted to check to see whether or not the user ID already existed. And so to do that now, we're going to leverage our user here, our users rather, and we are going to enumerate through each one of the existing users to see if an existing user has a matching ID. The first step to doing this is to making sure that our users has actually been initialized. And to do so, we simply say equal to new java.util.ArrayList. Once again, we specify that it is going to be an array list of users. And we now have an initialized users array, which then we can leverage in a helper function, a static helper function. So we're going to create one more function here. It's going to be public static, or for that matter, it actually can be private because it only needs to be accessed within our class. So we can have private static, and what we can call this is verify ID. Okay. And then you can pass to it an ID, or you can simply pass to it the partially created object. To probably the most logical way to go about doing this, and also potentially to support overloading in the future, would be to simply pass to it the ID that you wish to check, and the return value then is just going to be a Boolean. So we'll have a Boolean verify ID, and one of the other ways to do this is just to simply have a function called an exists. Okay, so basically public static exists, and what this does is this will loop through each one of our users to see whether or not that ID already exists. We're going to leave this as verify ID. We may come back and change the name. But what we'll do here is we'll create a results variable, and we're going to set it equal to false to begin with, and then return results. That at least will keep this happy for now. And then what we want to do here with this ID is we simply want to loop through each one of our users, and we want to verify that the ID does not already exist here. So we can build a for loop or a while loop. Doesn't really matter either way. If we do a while loop, we can at least exit out of it a little bit more gracefully. So for instance, when results are equal to true, we can exit out of the while loop. So let's go about doing it that way. We can do it once again with a for loop, but we're going to go ahead and create a integer, which is going to be equal to index. We're going to start it off at 0. And so we're going to loop, we're going to say while index is less than, and you can use the fully qualified name, or you can simply say users dot size. So while index is less than users dot size, and results equal to false. And basically what we're going to do now is we're simply going to compare We are going to make a false assumption, or I guess a naive assumption, that any existing ID has already been initialized, so we don't have to check to see if it's null. So we're going to very crudely or very simplistically simply check to see if users dot get the user at that particular index dot ID is equal to our ID. We would be better off to use the string compare functions. So our compare to, we shouldn't necessarily worry about case here. So rather than do the double equals, then we can simply do the compare to ignore case. And if you recall, then this returns a Boolean. So if this is equal to true, my apologies, if this returns 0, then basically what we say here is results are equal to true. There's another way of going about doing this here, where you can just simply set or assign the results when you do the compare to ignore case. But in this case, then this will kick us out of the while loop. And under the else branch, then what we simply want to do is index plus plus to make sure that we increment through our list. Now, what does that get us? Well, if our verify ID returns true, then that means we have to find another ID. So our first attempt at this is to create this temporary ID. And if it's made up of the first name or the last name, or rather a combination of the first name and the last name, you can imagine that there will easily be duplicates. So a neat little trick here would then be just simply to add an integer on to this combination. So we have the first name, the first character of the first name, the last name, then we would simply append an integer onto it and then keep checking to see if they were duplicates. And so easiest way to do this is just simply to create an integer here. We're going to say index, and we're going to assign it a value of 1. From there, then you can decide how you want to handle this, or maybe you start off with 0. Doesn't really matter here. But what you do down here then is use this temporary ID that we created earlier. I'm going to comment out the first one, and we're going to start off by saying our ID is going to be equal to the first name dot, once again, character at 0. We're going to append the last name, but then in addition to that, we're actually going to use the java dot lang dot integer, and we're going to use the toString method of it to convert that index then into a string and append it onto the first character of the first name and the last name. And then what we will do is we will simply have a while loop that will test against our EE333 dot user dot verify ID, and we're going to pass this ID, and so we're going to continue while this verify ID equals to, and remember what the default value is. The default value for it is false. So if this verify ID returns false, you come up here, this verify ID returns false, then it means that there was no match. If it returns true, then it means that there was a match. So now inside of this loop right here, or the trigger of this loop, is if this verify ID is equal to false, then that means a match was not found. So while this verify ID is equal to true, then what we want to do is we simply want to increment our index, okay? Once we increment our index, we simply regenerate our ID and we try it again until the verify ID comes back false, kicks us out of our while loop, and then we simply have this dot ID is equal to ID. The last bit that we're going to do in this video is going to be now to work on our import. Now we're going to start with our import custom, and we're going to come back to our import XML. But what I want to do is I want to get us started now on our import custom. And our import custom, to provide some context, needs to have an input file, or at least a string to work from. And so I've created this one using my information here. The idea here is that we want to be able to read from this custom formatted file. In this case, it's a colon space is our delimiter. Each piece of information is on a separate line. You're not guaranteed that all of the information is there necessarily, but this just gets us started, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to pass a string that ideally would have all of this contents to our import custom, and we're going to parse it and then verify that we've got enough information to actually create an object, and then additional information will be added before returning the object. Once again, this is the purpose behind this factory method here. And so to do so, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a user, and we're just going to call it a temp user, because we're not necessarily going to know yet whether or not it's actually going to be fully defined. So we're not even going to initialize it yet. We're just going to use it as a placeholder. We also want to go ahead and create placeholder or temporary variables for the minimum amount of information that we must have in order to actually create our object. And so to do that, we're going to be needing ideally an ID, a first name, and a last name. Now, it's not absolutely required, but I would suggest going ahead and initializing these, and you'll see why in just a second, because basically we're going to leverage the length of these to determine whether or not enough information was provided. Now, the last thing that we're going to need as far as maybe not the last thing, but additional variable that we're going to need is going to be this chunks variable, and this chunks variable is going to be a string array, and we're going to take this custom string and we're going to break it apart. The other temporary variable that we're going to need is going to be a lines variable, because we cannot guarantee that our custom string is going to be a single line. And so What we're going to do here is we're going to have a lines variable, and what we'll ultimately wind up doing is we will split then our custom string using the new line. And then for each one of the lines, we are going to attempt to determine if we have an ID, a first name, and a last name. So we start off, we split the custom string by the new line. And then what we do is we will need a temporary variable or for loop, for a while loop or for a for loop. So we'll say here for int index equal to 0, index less than lines dot length, index plus plus. And then inside of here, we will then split each one of the lines into chunks. And so we'll say chunks equal to lines square brackets index dot split, and then we're going to split it based on the colon and the space. And then since we recognize the pattern here, so if chunks dot length is going to be equal to 2, else we ignore it. Now what we want to do is we want to look at each one of the 0 index of chunks to determine if it's one of our field identifiers. And so if, for instance, chunks square brackets 0 dot compare to ignore case, if it matches then ID, so if this is equal to 0, then we have found our ID, and we simply say ID is equal to chunks square brackets 0. Else if chunks square brackets 0 dot compare to ignore case, the first name well, we've found our first name. And we continue with this pattern for all of our required fields. So in other words, we look for our last name, and then if we in fact do not match any of these, so in other words, in our else, we once again, we ignore it. Now, once we've managed to make it completely out of our for loop, in other words, we've looped through all the lines that were given to us, now what we want to do is check to see what the length is of our ID. So in other words, if our ID dot length is greater than 0 and our first name is greater than 0, and our last name dot length is greater than 0, well, what that means is that we call our 3-argument constructor. Else, and we could write this logic differently here. Else if we only are provided with the first and last name, then we call our 2-argument constructor. At this point now, you have 2 decisions or 2 things to think about. What happens, for instance, when you do in fact not have all of the information you need to create an object? If you come down here to our user again, one of the possibilities that we can do is we can create a private constructor that is parameterless. So in this case, what we'll have is we'll have a private user, and then inside of this one, then all we do is we simply set the ID equal to an empty string, the first name equal to an empty string, the last name equal to an empty string, and so on. And particularly then the status, at least for now, we would want to set the status equal to incomplete. What this gets us then is up here in this factory that we have, we simply say else, and then our temp user then gets created with the parameterless constructor. So we call the parameterless. All right, so let's get started with this one. If you recall that we have our temp user up here, and in the first one, we just simply say temp user is going to be equal to new user. And for this, then we specify we have all 3. We specify the string, the ID, excuse me, the first name and the last name. If we have the only the 2 arguments, then we say new user ID, user, and we let the system determine the ID or your code. And then the third possibility would be then temp user is equal to new user, and we simply call the parameterless constructor. Okay, so note we are leveraging the flag /enum. Now, the second issue that we want to handle is what do we do about these extra fields? In other words, lines 4, 5, 6, and 7. So the approach, and the reason I wanted to have this empty or initialized but poorly defined temp user as a result of this parameterless constructor is now the logic to handle the rest of this isn't quite as complicated. So what we can do here is up here in this section, in addition to identifying the ID, the first name and the last name, we could also identify the additional fields here. So create a couple of temporary variables, string, address, once again, initialize it, empty quotes, city is also going to be empty quotes, state, empty quotes, and then the status, we will decide how we're going to deal with that. But at the very least, what we're going to have here is unknown. Now, Down here, we know that the temp user's status is going to be incomplete. We can't set it publicly. However, in the parameterless constructor down here, we've set it to incomplete. So that part's handled for us. The only thing then that's left is how do we deal with the address, the city, the state? And what we can do here is we can create a couple more lines. So we'll have an else if chunks square bracket 0 dot compare to ignore case, and if it matches the address, then you've got your address field out of chunks square bracket 0. And likewise then for the city and the state. So I'm just going to quickly do a copy paste here, clean up some variables. And by the way, there is an alternate way of going about doing this. Instead of using a series of temporary variables, you can actually use a dictionary to accomplish roughly the same thing. But this, in my mind, is a little cleaner, at least the first pass through. Now, after your second block here, this if statement here, now what you can do is you can simply say temp user dot address equal to address, temp user dot city equal to city, and then temp user dot state equal to state. Which then brings us to our very last question. How do we import the status? Well, if it's essential that we import the status, in other words, our system is going to use inactive and active, we're going to want to reconstitute that from a file, then by necessity, then unfortunately, what we're going to have to do is down here at the bottom, much like with our set address, set city, set state, we're also going to want to create a set status. And so I'm going to go ahead and borrow the comment pattern here. And I want to set the status to set, and this will be public void set status, and then the particular status that is going to be passed, and this is simply going to be then this dot status equal to status. Now, what does that get us? Well, if we go back up here to our factory method, where we are importing it, we can pull then the status from the file, and we can set it here. All right. as well as being able now to set it publicly. Well, this should probably have you wondering then, how do we get the status back out of the file, especially given the fact that it may have been stored as a string and you are going to convert it then back into an enum. So depending on how you stored it, if you stored it as an integer value, then you'll handle it one way. If you stored it as a string, or as its, I guess you could say it's a representation, then what you would do here then is you would have one more else if, chunks, square brackets, 0, dot compare to ignore case. And in this case, we're going to then look at the status, and if that is equal to 0. We would love to just simply be able to do status equals to chunks, square brackets, 0. However, that is not going to work. And so your second attempt may be to think about, is there a method associated with an enum that allows for you to convert a string into an enumerator? And the answer is yes. It is going to be seen under the status dot value of. And so the value of chunks, square brackets, 0 would work. However, this can throw an error, throw an exception. And so to mitigate that, first of all, this will not work. For an enum, what you want to do here is you want to have a try, catch, and what we want to do here is we want to be able to catch a exception of a illegal argument. And to do that, we're going to simply say catch, and then Java dot lang dot illegal argument exception, and we're just going to call it EX. And in which case, we're going to first try essentially to parse this using the code that we just saw the value of. Okay. And if, for instance, this does not work, we just simply say status is equal to E333.status. And then at this point, you can choose whether you want to do incomplete or unknown. It doesn't really matter either way. All right, so this is going to wrap up this video. In the next one, we're going to take a look at how we're going to open the text file and actually read in the contents and essentially run it through our custom string. And then finally, what we'll do is we will address our export custom. And then the last set of this will then look at the export XML.